Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in the clown decade. The decade where things are going to get worse before they get better. And fortunately today, we have some news of the getting better variety. Because Rishi Sunak saw the climate cultist demand for no more new oil and gas, and he basically gave them two fingers. PM gives green light for more North Sea drilling. Sunak hopes 100 new oil and gas licences will put clear blue water between Tories and Labour, and that is a good amount of new licences. If my geology education is up to scratch, a licence is basically a permit to drill into a certain area of land, or in this case the ocean, or ocean floor. And obviously they vary in size, but they're usually relatively large. And thankfully the BBC has given us a good map of all the licensing areas that have been given in the North Sea and also in the UK. And these are just the ones that we currently have. I can imagine that the new licences will be all around the oil and gas fields and possibly some more carbon storage licences, but let's get into the detail. Rishi Sunak will commit himself today to pressing ahead with oil and gas exploration and production in the North Sea as he seeks to open up dividing lines with Labour. The Prime Minister will use a trip to Scotland to confirm that the government will issue 100 licences to companies that want to extract oil and gas from the North Sea. The licences will be granted in September. He will also seek to max out production of the North Sea's remaining reserves by agreeing to further licensing rounds in the future in an attempt to drive up production. Excellent. That's everything I would love to hear. Because why leave the useful stuff in the ground? Why not extract the useful stuff and replace it with the non-useful stuff that everyone is worried about, which is the carbon dioxide? You literally have an entire storage area that we have made for ourselves. Use it. Well, I actually know why we don't put carbon dioxide underground yet. It's because it is very, very, very expensive. But if these companies come up with a really cheap way to convert existing oil platforms into carbon dioxide pumping stations, why not do it? Labour has said it is opposed to issuing new oil and gas licences amid concerns about the impact on the environment and questions over whether they represent value for money. I can only imagine they do, yes. The party will revoke any licences that have not reached the final stages if it wins the election, so Sunak better hurry up, because while I am happy about this, I still don't think it will be enough to win the next election. Sunak views fossil fuels as a key part of Britain's transition to net zero, which is true, and the chance of us actually reaching net zero are zero, ironically. The government is expected to announce 2 new licences for carbon capture and storage in the North Sea this morning in an attempt to mitigate the environmental impact. Good, that's fine. Getting CO2 out of the atmosphere this way is perfectly reasonable. Sunak is committed to the government's target of hitting net zero emissions by 2050, but has said that it must be done in a pragmatic and proportionate way without burning the people with additional cost. Yes, that is exactly how you should phrase it. Because rushing into net zero will cause people's bills to run up higher and higher. I mean, we've been seeing that for years anyway. No one can afford new builds because they all have to have these very expensive heat pumps that first-time buyers can't afford. Source, I'm a first-time buyer. And if you wish to replace a gas boiler with a heat pump, that can cost tens of thousands of pounds to do. The reality is that heat pumps are a bad idea until that cost can come down, and that's generally how it's all going at the moment anyway, and with electric vehicles say as well. It costs tens of thousands and it costs thousands to service it, even though it technically should take less time and effort to service an electric vehicle as you have less moving parts to service. I do mean this unironically, but a lot of green energy stuff is just a scam to use against the wealthier part of the middle class who care vehemently about this stuff and are the type of people you see getting arrested for joining Just Stop Oil protests. Sunak claims that Labour's ban on new oil and gas licences will cost jobs and put Britain's energy security at risk. Labour has rejected the claim and argued that Britain should be pushing for more renewables instead of subsidising new oil and gas. Been pushing for renewables for years, everything's just getting expensive. I really do hate the claim that green energy will make everything cheaper, because it's simply not true. That's only true if the sun is shining all the time or if it's always windy. When it's not, you need to fire up the oil and gas stations to make up for the missing energy, and that actually ends up making it cost more than if it was just running all the time. And then that cost is hidden from the solar and wind energy prices. And again, it's just a bit of jiggery pokery with the numbers, but I go through that all the time. The Conservatives view green issues as a key area before the next election. At the weekend, Sunak backed a review of low-traffic neighbourhoods, which use bollards, planters and cameras to turn away cars. He said he was on the side of the motorists, and I do agree. Because it's trying to get people to take alternative ways of transport via cycling, walking or public transport, effectively by coercion and taking away choice from people. And I personally, and I think the Conservatives should be on this side as well, there should be more choice in cases like that. For example, in my area, a lot of people use cars because there is one bus an hour that goes to the nearest train station that then gets you into central Manchester, and those trains come about every hour and take about 40 minutes to actually get into Manchester Piccadilly. Now, if you improve that public transport network, people will probably use it more. I don't think people are going to use it more if you put bollards in front of road junctions. Sunak is, however, resisting calls from MPs on the right of his party to push back a ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2030 to 2035. We are not considering a delay to that date, he said at the weekend, and that's quite a bit of a shame. Because it seems that Rishi Sunak was on the side of choice when it comes to motorists, when it comes to low traffic neighbourhoods, but then when it comes to actually buying said motor cars, he seems to be against the choice. I guess at least you can buy second-hand cars, but why stop all of them? And there's other stories of Sunak when it comes to motor cars, but we will get into that soon. For now, we will keep on with the North Sea story and move on to this. Rishi Sunak to pour millions into North Sea carbon capture. The PM plans to outflank Labour on oil and gas with a scheme creating 21,000 jobs, doing something good for the environment, unironically this time, and also, ironically, completely undermining the whole climate cultist agenda, because their problem is that they want less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, hence they keep going on about it, although that is quite obviously just a front. They actually just want degrowth and to make everyone's lives more miserable. The proof is that they are against things like carbon capture storage, but they barely have a principled argument against it, because how could they possibly have an argument against taking CO2 from the atmosphere and pumping it underground? Rishi Sunak is to announce multi-million-pound funding for carbon capture project in Scotland to open a dividing line with the Labour Party and SNP over North Sea oil and gas. Prime Minister will visit Aberdeenshire tomorrow to set out new funding for Acorn project, which aims to capture carbon dioxide emissions from across the country for offshore storage in the North Sea. Supporters say it could create up to 21,000 jobs, which is pretty good. Supporters say the technology is vital to Britain realising its net zero ambitions while allowing oil and gas production to continue. Excellent. I'm fine with that compromise. The Tories will argue that by backing the carbon capture storage scheme, they are supporting the drive to net zero while still backing business. And with the ridiculous amount of windfall tax that we still currently have on energy companies, we should be able to fund this pretty easily. Or even better, don't bother taking taxes on it at all, and instead just legislate so that they either need to pay a carbon tax, or they can save on the carbon tax by investing in the carbon capture and storage scheme. Although Labour supports CCS, earlier this year the Sunday Times revealed that Sir Keir Starmer was opposed to new licences for oil and gas drilling in the North Sea. Scottish nationalists also have a presumption against further exploration. Critics have warned that it will lead to major job losses. And I swear part of the reason that the SNP wanted independence and said that independence could actually work is because of the North Sea oil and gas fields. So why are they against the new drilling in the North Sea if that's how they expect their economy to run? Both Labour and the Tories are battling internal divisions over their green policies, as there will be everywhere, because the whole of the British institution, every single one of them, seems to have been completely captured by climate cultists. Starmer's party narrowly lost the Uxbridge and South Ruislip by-election, sparking tensions with Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, whose plans to extend the ULEZ charge on heavy polluting vehicles was blamed for the defeat, and we'll get into that as well. Sunak has insisted that he is committed to achieving the 2050 net zero carbon emissions target, but a pragmatic and proportionate way, signalling his intention to draw a dividing line between the Conservatives and Labour on environmental issues ahead of the next general election. Some of the right of his party want him to go further, however, and I'm one of those people. I mean, while I do have a lot of praise for Sunak throughout this video, it isn't far enough at all. There needs to be a complete and utter annihilation of climate cultism in British institutions Rishi Sunak is in a position where he can at least get them on some sort of front. He's doing that with the oil and gas licenses, but he needs to drop net zero by 2050. Just get rid of it. It's not worth it. All it's doing is helping manage our decline. He obviously needs to get rid of the petrol cars, which we'll get into in just a minute. And Just Stop Oil need to be treated as they were on the day of the King's coronation. They just need to be dealt with a heavy hand, because, quite frankly, they don't particularly care for anyone else, only their own sense of ego. Because the climate is such a complicated thing, there's no way you can just bring it down to the very basic, more CO2 equals bad, and therefore more fossil fuels is bad, because of reasons that I've gone through in a bunch of other videos. They are essentially like the street preachers of olden days who thought themselves as good people because they thought they were spreading the word of God, and really they were just saying what comes to their minds that made them feel good. It's exactly the same. Anyway, speaking of which, Rishi Sunak motors on with 2030 petrol car ban, opposed by 7 in 10 Tories. The Prime Minister has rejected calls by Conservative MPs to delay the ban. I mean, what is the point of offering you oil and gas licences if you are then going to ban the main thing that uses them? 7 in 10 Tory voters oppose the government's plan to ban sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2030, a poll has found. Rishi Sunak this week rejects calls by Conservative MPs to delay the ban, or just get rid of it altogether would be a lot better. A YouGov poll from the Times found that 68% of Tory voters were opposed to the 2030 deadline, while 27% were in favour. Overall, 42% of voters opposed the plan, while 42% backed them. The polling also suggests that while there were significant support from the government's net zero targets, with 71% of voters in favour, people were less willing to pay for it. More than half of those polled, 55%, said that they would be unwilling to accept additional costs for ordinary people, while 27% said that they would accept extra costs. So, in other words, most Tory voters are sane, in that just over half of them are only accepting of ways to help with getting to net zero as long as it doesn't cause additional costs for, I mean, they say ordinary people, that typically just means middle class or lower. And this is a big problem that I've been saying for years about net zero. It's going to cost way too much, and it's going to make too many people much poorer, which I don't think is acceptable. And considering we've been world leaders in reducing our carbon emissions, and we only input about 1% of global carbon emissions, I don't think it's us that we should be focusing on. I think we've done more than enough. I think it's about time we actually focus on our own population and try and make our living standards better, rather than trying to accept anything worse than we already have. That is the point of human civilization. You're trying to make things better for the next generation every time. More than 40 Tory MPs and peers signed a letter to the Prime Minister urging him to delay the ban on petrol and diesel cars until 2035. Sunak told the Sunday Telegraph the 2030 target had been our policy for a long time and continues to be. We are not considering a delay to that date. Which is quite insane to say, actually. He says it's for a long time. Initially, there was going to be a ban about 3 years ago, introduced by Johnson for 2040, and then it was subsequently brought down to 2035, and then finally to 2030, and I think that final decision was about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, something like that. To say it's been a policy for a very long time is ridiculous to say. It wasn't even in the last manifesto. Ministers fear that companies would react badly to the delay, having made investment decisions based on the 2030 date, such as electric vehicle battery gigafactory near Bridgewater, Somerset, announced by Tata, the parent company of Jaguar Land Rover. The reaction from someone like JLR would be pretty negative after they've just announced a $4 billion battery plant, a government source said. They added that the deadline is palpably attracting investment into the UK. If we started to muck about with that, there would be people in the car sector saying, hang on, you're not serious, which is just a ridiculous argument. Why, if, as we are always told, these new ways of moving about, getting in cars and producing energy are much cheaper than the alternatives, and therefore would be a lot easier to sell for these companies, why would they complain if you are allowing more competition back in the classic way to get around? It's probably because they've been lying about that. And they were annoyed in the first place of you making this decision. If you delay it or just get rid of it, they can just deal with it, and they'll probably be pretty happy that they can expand their petrol and diesel car sales to beyond 2030. They might say, wait, are you serious? Why have you done this? But I think it's a lot more because they will be annoyed that they could have invested in planning to sell cars for 5 years more, really it should be forever more, than the short term, oh, that's annoying, we couldn't do that in the first place. That doesn't mean they're going to stop investing in electric vehicles or anything like that. It just gives them another 5 years to do it. Anyway, time to move on to a lot of what London-centric viewers will be worried about. Rishi Sunak attacks Sadiq Khan's ULEZ expansion as unfair tax on drivers. The Mayor of London has decided to forge ahead with expanding ULEZ across all of Greater London, rather than just having it in central London. Sadiq Khan's plans to expand the ultra-low emission zones, or ULEZ, has been attacked by Rishi Sunak as an unfair tax on drivers, and that's because it is. Mr Khan, the Mayor of Greater London, has decided to forge ahead with expanding ULEZ across all of Greater London. This will see the daily charge of £12.50 imposed on vehicles entering the outer limits of the capital that do not comply with emissions criteria. In other words, if they're not electric cars. Earlier this week, however, Mr Khan was accused of manipulating a public consultation on ULEZ after it emerged thousands of votes had been deliberately excluded by City Hall. The allegations have been denied by the Mayor. Some 5,200 votes from motoring groups include Fairfuel UK, which were equivalent to 1 in 10 responses, were discounted by officials, allowing the Mayor to claim there was no overwhelming dissent by reducing opposition to the plans. I mean, that in itself is hilarious. That's just pure, unadulterated corruption from Sadiq Khan, which I am not at all surprised at. If you discount the motoring groups, i.e. the groups that are most likely to dissent, of course you're not going to see any dissent. It's a bit like of course you're going to see a scientific consensus if you just ignore all the scientists that are going against said consensus. But seriously, just charging people £12.50 per day every time they want to use a car, that's £87.50 per day, assuming you use the car every day, which obviously a lot of traders will do. And even if they are only using their cars on the work week, that's still an extra £62.50 a week, which is the equivalent of £250 a month. You know, that's quite a lot of money just to be able to do your job. Because I know we were planning to have a similar thing over here in Manchester, but it got dropped because basically every single person who has a job where they need to drive was lobbying against it, because why the hell would they want to be charged to do their job? At Prime Minister's Questions on Wednesday, Craig McKinley, the Tory MP for South Thanet, told the Commons, evidence is now clear that the London Mayor's sham consultation has suppressed 5,000 negative responses from members and supporters of Fairfuel UK, of which I am the APPG chairman. Now, what angers me is that this tax is against my residents in South Thanet. It's a tax against Kent residents. It's a tax against all of the home counties. This is true taxation without representation. Will my right honourable friend assure me that he will do all that he can to stop this, because it is a tax that is filled up against a failed mayor's budget and a failed mayor? And Mr Sunak replied, my right honourable friend makes an excellent point and powerful point. The Labour mayor is imposing a tax on the public which does not want it. He's right to highlight that. Expanding this zone is not something that communities want, and I look forward to working with him to urge the mayor to do properly, consider and respond to all of these views and stop this unfair tax. And hopefully they go through with it. I mean, obviously Sadiq Khan is going to completely ignore Rishi Sunak, but if that happens, hopefully it's in time for Rishi Sunak to make some legislation against the expansion of ULEZ, because it is an absolutely outrageous plan that has been rejected by a bunch of other cities and is apparently being rejected by London's own residents that the Mayor of London is just ignoring. He can't get away with that. And the final bit of Tory good news is just this quick story. Ministers are considering restrictions on councils' ability to impose 20-mile-per-hour speed limits as part of a new shift against green policies and traffic schemes, a stance condemned by safety and travel groups as short-sighted and divisive. The Guardian's been told the push against what Rishi Sunak has termed anti-motorist policies could be extended to find ways to stop local authorities taking other measures, such as installing bus gates that have been used routinely for decades. The Prime Minister has already ordered a review of low-traffic neighbourhoods in the wake of this month's Uxbridge by-election, where an unexpected narrow Conservative win was helped by concerns about London Mayor Sadiq Khan's expansion of London's ULEZ scheme. It's now understood that other plans are being considered which could limit councils' powers to impose 20-mile-per-hour zones and other measures. Now, the 20-mile-per-hour thing, the Tories are not really going against it in areas where it makes sense, such as directly outside schools, which is where you mainly see them in England. But in places like Wales, they're really trying to push for every time there is a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit, they want that reduced to 20 miles an hour. And that is obviously going to be happening in Scotland as well, because they're mad. And then there are, of course, other councils who are trying to follow suit under the guise of better safety and less emissions. And the thing is that the chance of you surviving a 30-mile-per-hour collision as a pedestrian is about 80%. You are 80% likely to not have a fatal injury if that happens. And obviously, if you're at 20 miles an hour, it goes down to around 2% or something like that. And that is quite a dramatic drop. But the thing is, Britain already has some of the safest roads in the world. As you can see from this Wikipedia list, we are literally the 9th safest when it comes to number of road deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. It's about 3 people, and it is on par with Ireland and Kiribati, wherever that is. And it's an even better rate per 100,000 motor vehicles. We genuinely have some of the safest roads in the world. There is absolutely no need for this 20 mile per hour limit to be imposed on anyone. Again, school areas where it gets busy during school time, that makes a lot more sense. When it comes to generally 30 mile per hour roads, which most main roads in the UK are, having that dialed down to 20 miles per hour is just ludicrous. There's no point. You'll make that statistic go from 2.9 per 100,000 inhabitants to 2.9 per 100,000 inhabitants. In fact, it might go up due to the road rage of people having to spend longer in their car. So with that, when it comes to motorist road safety, and even for pedestrians and cyclists, we're doing really well as a country. Some of the safest roads in the world. Good to see. When it comes to carbon emissions, we're also pretty world leading on that, especially when it comes to developed nations. Nothing to worry about there. Let's get some carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, pump it underground, while we pump up the gas and oil, and hopefully one day we'll even get onto fracking, though I don't have my hopes very high. And it's good to see that the Prime Minister and a lot of Tory MPs are on board with this type of thing. Rishi Sunak isn't quite going as far as I'd want him to, but, well, when it comes to all the depressing news we get from the Tory party and politics recently, I'm going to take what I can get. So hopefully that's been a bit of good news for you at the start of this week, and long may it continue. But anyway, that's everything I had for you today, so once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.